London, 1845. Grace Darlington pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the drawing-room window, watching raindrops race down the pane like the tears she refused to shed. Her reflection stared back at her, sharp cheekbones, unusual amber eyes, a mouth too wide for conventional beauty, a face that had earned her the cruel sobriquet, the golden gargle, among London's elite. "Miss Darlington, your aunt requests your presence in the parlour." Grace straightened her spine, smoothing the wrinkles from her modest grey day dress. "Thank you, Hopkins. Please inform her I shall be down directly." The butler bowed and departed, leaving Grace to steel herself for what would undoubtedly be another lecture on her failings as a potential bride. At 23, she was firmly on the shelf, a fact her aunt never failed to emphasize. Not that Grace harbored any delusions about her prospects. 4 disappointing seasons had taught her that love and marriage were luxuries reserved for the beautiful and well-dowered, neither of which described her. She gave her reflection one final, critical glance. "You are what you are," she whispered to herself, "and that shall have to be enough." In the parlour, Aunt Agatha reclined on a chaise, fan fluttering despite the room's chill. "There you are, Grace. Must you always keep me waiting?" "I apologize, Aunt," Grace said, taking a seat on the edge of a nearby chair. "Well, never mind that now. I've received correspondence from your cousin Louisa. The Countess of Westmoreland's annual autumn ball is to be held next week, and we have secured invitations." Grace's stomach tightened. "Another ball, Aunt? I had thought perhaps—" "You had thought what?" "That after 4 failed seasons, you might be permitted to fade into spinsterhood without further attempt." Aunt Agatha's fan snapped closed. "Your father did not leave you a fortune sufficient to maintain independence, Grace. Without a husband, you shall remain dependent upon my charity indefinitely." The words strung, as they were meant to. Grace had heard variations of this speech countless times since coming to live with her aunt following her parents' deaths 6 years prior. "I am grateful for all you have done," Grace said quietly. "As well you should be. Now we shall need to have your blue silk gown refurbished. Perhaps some new trim will make it appear less dated." Aunt Agatha's gaze travelled over Grace with the calculation of a merchant assessing damaged goods. "And for heaven's sake, do something with your hair. Those unruly curls make you look like a wild creature." Grace nodded, knowing argument was futile. She had learned early that beauty was the only currency that mattered in the marriage market, and she was desperately poor. "There is one more thing," Aunt Agatha continued. "The Duke of Clarenmont has returned to London." Grace's head jerked up in surprise. "The Duke has been abroad for years. 5 years, to be precise. Following that unfortunate business with his brother." Aunt Agatha's expression grew hungry with gossip. "They say he returns much changed, harder, colder, but his fortune remains intact, and he has yet to secure a duchess." "Surely you don't imagine," Grace began, then stopped herself. The notion was too absurd to voice. A duke would never look twice at Grace Darlington, not when he could have his pick of England's most beautiful debutantes. "I imagine nothing," Aunt Agatha replied. "I merely inform you that he is expected at the Westmoreland ball, and you will comport yourself with absolute propriety." The warning in her tone was unmistakable. Grace's reputation, such as it was, remained the only asset she possessed besides her modest dowry. Later that evening, as her lady's maid brushed out her long golden hair, Grace allowed herself a rare moment of honesty before her looking-glass. Her features were not conventional, true, but perhaps they might have been deemed striking in another woman, one with confidence, fortune, and connections. "What nonsense," she murmured, dismissing the thought. Experience had taught her that dreams led only to disappointment. Love was a luxury for the beautiful and the wealthy. For women like Grace, practicality was the only safe harbor. The Westmoreland ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off jewels and silken gowns. Grace kept to the edges of the room, a habit formed over 4 seasons of avoiding pitying glances and barely concealed whispers. Her refurbished blue gown was modest compared to the elaborate creations surrounding her, but she had taken extra care with her appearance tonight, not for any foolish hopes regarding the Duke, but for her own dignity. "Miss Darlington, I believe." Grace turned, startled by the male voice addressing her directly. The gentleman was unfamiliar, tall and lean, with warm brown eyes and a kind smile. "Mr. Thomas Everett," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "Might I request the honor of the next dance?" Surprise momentarily robbed Grace of speech. Gentlemen rarely sought her out, especially at grand affairs like this, where beauty was displayed like prize cattle at a fair. "You are too kind, Mr. Everett," she finally managed, "but I fear I must decline." His expression fell. "Have I offended in some way?" "Not at all," Grace assured him. "I simply prefer to observe this evening." The truth was more complicated. Grace had learned that unexpected attention from gentlemen was rarely genuine. Either they had lost a wager, sought to curry favor with her aunt, or mistook her for someone else entirely. Mr. Everett looked disappointed but bowed graciously. "Another time, perhaps." "Perhaps," Grace echoed, though they both knew it was unlikely. As he departed, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Grace caught her first glimpse of the Duke of Clarenmont. Even from a distance, his presence commanded the room. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the confident grace of a man accustomed to power. His dark hair was cut shorter than fashion dictated, and his face bore the golden tan of someone recently returned from warmer climes. But it was his expression that caught Grace's attention, remote, assessing, as if he found the entire affair beneath his notice. "The Duke appears even less pleased to be here than you," a feminine voice commented beside her. Grace turned to find Lady Helena Merriweather, one of the few kind souls among the ton. "Good evening, Lady Helena. You're looking well. And you've done something different with your hair. It suits you." Helena nudged Grace gently. "Did you know the Duke has refused every introduction attempted thus far?" Lady Westmoreland is beside herself. "Perhaps he finds the entire exercise distasteful," Grace suggested, "being paraded before the ton like a prize bull." Helena laughed. "A sentiment you share, I think." "The difference being that no one wishes to parade me anywhere," Grace replied dryly. Before Helena could respond, a hush fell over their corner of the ballroom. Grace looked up to find the Duke of Clarenmont himself approaching. His eyes, a startling, penetrating blue, were fixed directly on her. Grace froze, certain he must be looking at someone else. But when he stopped before her and bowed, there could be no mistake. "Miss Darlington," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "I believe this dance is mine." It wasn't a request. Grace's mind raced. How did he know her name? They had never been introduced. And why would he single her out among all the beautiful women present? "Your Grace," she began, her voice barely audible over the hammering of her heart, "I fear there has been some misunderstanding. We are not acquainted." A smile touched his lips, transforming his severe countenance into something dangerously appealing. "An oversight I intend to rectify immediately. James Clarenmont, at your service." He extended his hand, leaving Grace little choice but to place her gloved fingers in his palm. The orchestra struck the first notes of a waltz as he led her to the center of the floor. "Everyone is staring," Grace whispered, acutely aware of the shocked faces surrounding them. "Let them," the Duke replied, his hand firm at her waist as he guided her into the dance. "I find I care very little for the opinions of London society these days." His declaration should have reassured her, but Grace could not shake the suspicion that this unexpected attention concealed an ulterior motive. Her experiences had taught her to mistrust such inexplicable interest. "You must forgive my directness, Your Grace, but I cannot imagine what prompted this distinction." The Duke's gaze held hers, unflinching. "Perhaps I simply wished to dance with the most interesting woman in the room." "Now I know you mock me," Grace said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. His expression darkened. "I do not mock, Miss Darlington, nor do I flatter idly." The intensity of his regard discomforted her. They completed several turns in silence, Grace struggling to maintain her composure under the weight of 100 stares. "You're uncomfortable with attention," he observed. "I am unaccustomed to it," she corrected. "At least, the kind not accompanied by ridicule." Something flashed in his eyes, anger perhaps, though not directed at her. The tongue can be merciless to those who do not conform to its narrow definitions of worth. "You speak from experience, Your Grace." His mouth curved in a sardonic smile. "Let us say I understand what it is to be judged, and found wanting by those whose opinions matter least." The music drew to a close, and Grace expected the Duke to release her and move on to more promising prospects. Instead, he retained her hand and led her toward the terrace doors. "A moment of air, if you please," he said, in a tone that suggested he was not accustomed to refusal. Propriety demanded she decline, but curiosity, and something else she dared not name, propelled her forward. The terrace was mercifully empty, the night air cool against her flushed skin. "Now, Miss Darlington," the Duke said, turning to face her, "perhaps you might tell me why a woman of your intelligence and beauty hides herself in corners and refuses invitations to dance." Grace stiffened. "I do not hide, Your Grace. I merely occupy the position society has deemed appropriate for me." "And what position is that?" "The unremarkable spinster, destined for the fringes of ballrooms and the charity of relatives." The words emerged more bitterly than she intended. The Duke stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. "Is that truly how you see yourself?" Grace lifted her chin. "It is how I am seen." "Not by me." His simple declaration hung between them, impossible to dismiss, yet equally impossible to trust. Grace had built her defenses carefully over years of disappointment and ridicule. One dance, one moment of kindness, could not dismantle them. "You don't know me, Your Grace." "I know enough," he countered. "I know you face society's judgment with dignity. I know you possess a sharp wit and a sharper mind. And I know beauty when I see it, regardless of what fashion dictates." Grace's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her this way, as if she were worthy of regard, of admiration. It was intoxicating and dangerous. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability that matched her own. "Perhaps I recognize a kindred spirit, Miss Darlington. Someone who understands that the world's judgment rarely reflects one's true value." Before she could respond, the terrace doors opened, spilling light and conversation into their private moment. Aunt Agatha stood framed in the doorway, her expression a mixture of shock and calculation. "Grace, there you are. I've been looking everywhere." Her gaze darted between Grace and the Duke. "Your Grace, I do apologize if my niece has imposed upon your solitude." The Duke's face resumed its mask of aristocratic indifference. "Not at all, Mrs. Templeton. Miss Darlington has been gracious company." With a practiced bow, he excused himself, leaving Grace to face her aunt's interrogation. But as he passed through the doorway, he glanced back once, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that sent warmth coursing through her veins. "What in heaven's name were you thinking?" Aunt Agatha hissed once they were alone. "Unchaperoned on a terrace with the Duke of Clarenmont, do you wish to become the subject of scandal?" "It was merely a moment's respite from the heat of the ballroom," Grace defended, though she knew appearances suggested otherwise. Aunt Agatha's expression turned speculative. "He singled you out, Grace. The most eligible bachelor in England chose you for his first dance since returning to society." "A momentary aberration, I'm sure," Grace said, trying to ignore the small flicker of hope her aunt's words had kindled. "By tomorrow, he will have forgotten my existence." But her aunt was already plotting, her eyes bright with ambition. "We must act quickly. A new gown, no, several, and we shall accept every invitation this season. If the Duke has shown interest, we must nurture it." Grace listened in growing dismay. She knew this path led only to disappointment. Whatever the Duke's reasons for his attention tonight, they could not possibly include genuine admiration for Grace Darlington, the golden gargle of London society. Yet as they rejoined the ball, Grace could not help searching the crowd for his tall figure, her heart leaping when their eyes met across the room. For one unguarded moment, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? The following days passed in a whirlwind of fittings and social calls. Aunt Agatha, energized by the possibility of a connection to the Duke, spared no expense in outfitting Grace for the remaining events of the season. Grace submitted to the primping and preening with resigned patience, knowing it was futile but unable to deny her aunt's renewed enthusiasm. "Hold still," the dressmaker muttered, pins between her lips as she adjusted the hem of Grace's new evening gown, an extravagance of emerald silk that Aunt Agatha insisted brought out the golden tones in Grace's unusual eyes. "Is all this truly necessary?" Grace asked, watching her aunt circle her with critical assessment. "The Pemberton Musicale is tomorrow evening, and Lady Westmoreland's garden party the day after," Aunt Agatha replied. "The Duke is confirmed for both. We must ensure you outshine every other eligible young woman." Grace sighed. "Aunt, I appreciate your efforts, but I fear you're setting yourself up for disappointment." The Duke was merely being kind. The Duke of Clarenmont is many things, but merely kind is not among them, Aunt Agatha declared. "He has a reputation for cold reserve, particularly since that unfortunate business with his brother. If he showed you attention, there was purpose behind it." Grace remained unconvinced, but held her tongue. Arguing would only prolong the fitting. Later that evening, as Grace sat brushing her hair before bed, a knock at her bedroom door surprised her. Hopkins entered, bearing a silver salver upon which rested a small envelope. "This arrived by special messenger, Miss Darlington," the butler announced. "I was instructed to deliver it to your hands only." Puzzled, Grace accepted the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, sealed with dark blue wax bearing the Clarenmont crest. Her heart began to race even before she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in bold, masculine handwriting. "Miss Darlington, I find myself thinking of our conversation and regretting its brevity. If you would do me the honor of walking with me tomorrow in Hyde Park at 10 o'clock, I would be most grateful for the opportunity to continue our acquaintance. My carriage will await your convenience should you choose to accept. Yours, Clarenmont." Grace read the note twice, scarcely believing its contents. A private invitation from a ducat was unprecedented, improper, and utterly thrilling. Aunt Agatha would be ecstatic, yet something held Grace back from immediately sharing the news. This moment, this possibility, felt too fragile to expose to her aunt's ambitious maneuvering. For once, Grace wanted to make her own decision, free from calculation or obligation. She slept little that night, torn between caution and hope. By morning, she had made her choice. She would meet the Duke, but on her terms. Not as a potential conquest or a desperate spinster, but as herself, Grace Darlington, with all her flaws and strengths. She dressed carefully in her most becoming morning dress of pale blue muslin, arranged her hair simply but becomingly, and left a note for her aunt claiming a headache required solitude. Then, heart-pounding, she slipped from the house to meet the Duke's waiting carriage. Hyde Park was relatively quiet at that hour, the fashionable crowd not yet emerged for their daily parade. Grace sat beside the Duke in his open carriage, acutely aware of his proximity and the impropriety of their meeting. "I confess I was not certain you would come," the Duke said, as they traveled toward a less frequented area of the park. "Nor was I," Grace admitted. "This is most irregular, Your Grace." "James," he corrected. "At least when we are away from prying ears." The familiarity startled her. "I don't think." "Please," he said, his voice softening. I have spent 5 years hearing only my title, never my name. It would be refreshing to be James again, if only for a morning. There was something vulnerable in his request that Grace could not refuse. Very well, James. His name felt intimate on her tongue, a small rebellion against propriety that thrilled her more than it should. The Duke, James, directed his coachman to stop near a secluded grove of trees. "Shall we walk?" he suggested, jumping down and offering his hand to assist her. Grace hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The strength of his grip, as he helped her from the carriage, sent a shiver of awareness through her. They began to stroll along a quiet path, the morning sun filtering through the trees above them. "You must wonder why I sought you out," James said, after they had walked in companionable silence for several minutes. "The thought has occurred to me," Grace acknowledged. "I am not accustomed to being singled out by dukes, or anyone else, for that matter." Which speaks poorly of society's discernment. He glanced down at her, his blue eyes intent. "The truth is, Miss Darlington—" "Grace," she interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "If I am to call you James, then fair exchange demands you use my given name." A smile transformed his face, erasing years of strain. "Grace," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "It suits you. There is a grace about you that has nothing to do with the ballroom." She felt herself blush and looked away. "You were about to explain your interest in me." His expression grew serious once more. "5 years ago, I left England following a bitter estrangement from my younger brother, Richard. He had fallen in love with a woman I believed unsuitable, a governess with no family connections and little fortune. I objected strenuously, invoking my authority as head of the family to forbid the match." Grace listened, wondering what this had to do with her, but content to let him tell his story at his own pace. "Richard defied me," James continued. "They married in secret and fled to Italy. I was furious, convinced he had been duped by an adventuress. I cut him off without a penny and refused all communication." He paused, pain etching lines around his mouth. 3 years ago, Richard and his wife died in a boating accident on Lake Como. I received the news months later, through mutual acquaintances. "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly, instinctively touching his arm in sympathy. James covered her hand with his own. "Before I could even begin to process my grief and regret, I received a package from Italy. It contained letters, dozens of them, that Richard had written to me over the years. Letters I had ordered returned unopened." They stopped walking, standing beneath the shelter of an ancient oak. "In those letters, I discovered the truth I had been too proud to see. His wife, Catherine, was everything good and true. Their love was genuine, their happiness complete, and I, in my arrogance, had denied myself the joy of knowing them in their happiness." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "How terrible for you." "The last letter contained something else," James said. "A small watercolor portrait of Catherine. When I saw it, I understood immediately why Richard had fallen in love with her. Not because she conformed to society's ideal of beauty, but because her face revealed her soul, intelligent, kind, strong." He turned to face Grace fully. "When I saw you at the Westmoreland ball, standing apart from the crowd, observing everything with those remarkable eyes, I was struck by how much you reminded me of her, not in features, but in essence. A woman judged by superficial standards and overlooked by those too blind to see true worth." Grace stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. "And this is why you approached me, because I reminded you of your brother's wife." "At first," he admitted, "but then we spoke, and I discovered something I had not expected." "What was that?" she whispered. His eyes held hers, unwavering. "That you are entirely yourself, Grace Darlington, unique, fascinating, and far more beautiful than you have been permitted to believe." No one had ever spoken to her this way, as if she were worthy, valuable, desirable. The cynical part of her mind warned that this was too perfect, too improbable. Dukes did not fall for unremarkable spinsters, no matter how compelling their backstories, yet the sincerity in his eyes made her want to believe. "I don't know what to say," she confessed. "Say you'll allow me to know you better," James replied. "Not in ballrooms or drawing rooms where every glance is noted and every word dissected, but here, in honest conversation between two people who understand what it means to be misjudged." The request was modest, reasonable even. Yet Grace sensed accepting would irrevocably alter her life's course. "I would like that," she said simply. Their walk extended well beyond propriety, though Grace could not bring herself to regret a moment. James spoke of his travels, his estates, his hopes to redeem the years lost to pride and misunderstanding. Grace, in turn, shared stories of her childhood in Derbyshire, her love of art and literature, her struggles since her parents' death. When at last they returned to the carriage, Grace felt lighter than she had in years, as if unburdening her thoughts had physically transformed her. "May I see you again tomorrow?" James asked as they approached her aunt's home. Prudence demanded she refuse. Two unchaperoned meetings would certainly raise eyebrows if discovered, yet Grace found herself nodding. "The same time." His smile warmed her to her core. "Until tomorrow, then." Grace entered the house in a daze of happiness, only to be confronted immediately by her aunt's accusing stare. "Where have you been?" Aunt Agatha demanded. "Your note claimed illness, yet Hopkins saw you leave the house hours ago." Grace had prepared no convincing lie. "I needed air and solitude to clear my head." "For 4 hours," her aunt's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Grace Darlington, if you have done anything to compromise yourself or this family's standing." "I have not," Grace interrupted, uncharacteristic firmness in her tone. "I am 23, not a child to be scolded for taking a morning constitutional." Aunt Agatha appeared taken aback by this show of independence. "Well, be that as it may, you must prepare for the Pemberton musicale this evening. The Duke is expected to attend." Grace merely nodded, a secret smile playing at her lips. Let her aunt scheme and plan. For once, Grace was steps ahead, navigating her own path. The Pemberton musicale proved to be a turning point. Grace entered the crowded drawing room on her aunt's arm, wearing her new emerald gown and feeling uncharacteristically confident. Her morning with James had awakened something in her, not just hope or attraction, but a sense of her own worth independent of society's valuation. Conversations stilled as she passed, heads turning to follow her progress. Grace was accustomed to stares, but these seemed different, curious rather than critical, assessing rather than dismissive. "Everyone is looking at you," Aunt Agatha whispered, triumph in her voice. "Word of the Duke's interest has spread." Before Grace could respond, Lady Pemberton approached, her calculating gaze sweeping over Grace. "Miss Darlington, how delightful you could attend," and looking so, transformed. The backhanded compliment might once have strung, but Grace merely smiled. "Thank you for including us, Lady Pemberton. I look forward to the musical selections this evening." As Lady Pemberton led them to their seats, Grace caught sight of James across the room. He was speaking with an elderly gentleman, but looking directly at her, appreciation evident in his gaze. Grace felt herself flush with pleasure. Throughout the performances, she was conscious of his presence, though propriety kept them apart. Only during the interval did he approach, bowing formally before her aunt. "Mrs. Templeton, Miss Darlington. I trust you are enjoying the music." Aunt Agatha practically preened. "Indeed, Your Grace. Miss Pemberton's rendition of Mozart was particularly moving." "And you, Miss Darlington?" James asked, his eyes holding hers. "What did you think of the performance?" "I preferred the Schubert," Grace replied honestly. "There was an emotional depth to the interpretation that touched me deeply." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "I share your assessment." Schubert understood the human heart in all its complexity. The exchange was brief, proper, and entirely unremarkable to observers. Yet Grace felt the weight of unspoken meaning in every word, every glance. They were performing for society while conducting an entirely different conversation beneath the surface. As James moved away, Lady Merriweather took the vacant seat beside Grace. "Well, well," she murmured, eyes twinkling. "It appears the Duke has excellent taste, after all." Grace ducked her head, embarrassed but pleased. "We've merely exchanged pleasantries, Helena." "Pleasantries that have the entire room buzzing," Helena countered. "You look different tonight, Grace. There's a light about you that wasn't there before." "Nonsense," Grace demurred. "It's merely the gown." But Helena wasn't so easily dismissed. "No, it's more than that. You carry yourself differently. Like a woman who knows her own worth." The observation was too close to the truth. Grace changed the subject, but Helena's words lingered. Was she truly transformed? Or was it merely the intoxicating effect of James's attention that could vanish as quickly as it had appeared? The next day brought their second clandestine meeting in the park, followed by another at a small art exhibition, and then a chance encounter at a bookshop that seemed far too convenient to be coincidence. With each meeting, Grace's feelings deepened, even as her practical mind warned against false hope. Society, meanwhile, had noticed the Duke's attentions. Invitations poured in for Grace and her aunt, doors previously closed now flung wide in anticipation of proximity to the season's most unexpected courtship. Whispers followed Grace everywhere, some envious, some incredulous, some outright hostile. "They say he's lost his mind," she overheard one young debutante whisper to another at Lady Westmoreland's garden party. "Imagine the Duke of Clarenmont besotted with the golden gargle. There must be something wrong with his eyesight." The cruel words pierced Grace's newfound confidence. Was that what everyone thought, that James must be deficient in some way to find her worthy of attention? "Pay them no mind," came a familiar voice beside her. Helena linked her arm through Grace's, steering her away from the gossips. "Jealousy makes vipers of angels." Grace attempted a smile. "I've endured worse." "But it wounds nonetheless," Helena observed shrewdly. "Especially now, when you have something precious to protect." Grace glanced across the garden, to where James stood in conversation with their host. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his expression softening visibly when their eyes met. "Is it so obvious?" Grace whispered. Helena squeezed her arm gently. "Only to those who know what to look for, but be careful, Grace. The tongue can be merciless when it senses vulnerability." The warning proved prophetic. That very evening, as Grace and her aunt prepared to leave the garden party, they were approached by the Dowager Duchess of Clarenmont, James's mother. The Dowager was a formidable figure, her aristocratic features frozen in a mask of perpetual disapproval. She intercepted them with calculated precision, her smile never reaching her cold eyes. "Mrs. Templeton, Miss Darlington," she acknowledged with the barest nod. "I believe we have not been formally introduced. I am the Duchess of Clarenmont." Aunt Agatha executed her most obsequious curtsy. "Your Grace, what an honor. We are most pleased to make your acquaintance." The Dowager's gaze rested on Grace, assessing and dismissive in equal measure. "Indeed, I have observed my son's interest in your niece with some curiosity." Grace felt herself flush under the scrutiny, but held the Duchess's gaze steadily. "Your son has been most kind, Your Grace." "Kind," the Dowager repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Yes, James has always had a tendency toward misplaced charity, a remnant of his father's influence, I fear." The deliberate insult hung in the air between them. Aunt Agatha looked stricken, but Grace found unexpected strength in her indignation. "Then we are fortunate that the late Duke's legacy continues through his son," Grace replied, her voice calm despite her racing heart. "Kindness is a quality to be treasured, not dismissed." The Dowager's eyes widened fractionally, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "You mistake me, Miss Darlington. I merely wish to ensure there are no misunderstandings regarding my son's intentions. The Duke of Clarenmont has responsibilities to his title and lineage that transcend personal inclinations. The message could not have been clearer. Grace was not considered suitable Duchess material. "We understand completely, Your Grace," Aunt Agatha interjected hurriedly. "Miss Darlington harbors no presumptions, I assure you." Grace remained silent, unwilling to contradict her aunt publicly, but seething inwardly at being discussed, as if she were not present. "Excellent," the Dowager said with a thin smile. "Then we understand one another perfectly. Good evening, ladies." As she swept away, Grace felt a hollow forming in her chest. Of course the Dowager was right. Whatever connection she and James had formed, whatever feelings had grown between them, reality remained immutable. He was a duke, bound by centuries of tradition and expectation. She was Grace Darlington, a woman whose own reflection had betrayed her since childhood. "Don't look so downcast," Aunt Agatha whispered fiercely as they waited for their carriage. "The Dowager is merely doing what any mother would, testing your mettle. If the Duke's interest is genuine, his mother's disapproval will matter little." But Grace knew better. James might believe himself immune to society's judgment, but no man, not even a duke, existed in isolation. Eventually, the weight of expectation, tradition, and duty would reassert itself. And when it did, whatever tender feelings he might harbor for Grace Darlington would crumble beneath it. Her fears seemed confirmed the following day when no message came from James, nor the next. By the third day of silence, Grace had convinced herself that the Dowager's intervention had succeeded. James had come to his senses, remembered his station, and abandoned whatever foolish fancy had drawn him to her. On the fourth morning, Grace was in the small back parlor that served as her refuge, attempting to lose herself in a book, when Hopkins appeared at the door. "A visitor for you, Miss Darlington." Grace looked up in surprise. "For me, who would?" Her words died as James himself appeared in the doorway behind Hopkins. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of neglect. "Your Grace," Grace said, rising quickly to her feet, "this is most unexpected." "Leave us," James instructed Hopkins, his tone brooking no argument. The butler hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and obeying a duke's direct command. "It's all right, Hopkins," Grace assured him. "Please inform my aunt we have a visitor." Once they were alone, James crossed the room in 3 long strides and took Grace's hands in his. "Forgive my absence. I've been at Clarenmont House, engaged in what can only be described as the most consequential battle of my life." Grace's heart fluttered traitorously. "I don't understand." "My mother," he explained, his expression darkening. "She informed me of your encounter at Lady Westmoreland's garden party and made her position abundantly clear. She believes my interest in you is a form of rebellion, a reaction to my estrangement from Richard rather than genuine attachment." Grace gently withdrew her hands from his. "Perhaps she is right, James. Perhaps what you feel for me is merely the shadow of your regret." "No," he said fiercely. "That's what I've spent these days determining, examining every moment, every feeling with ruthless honesty." He began to pace, energy radiating from him like heat from a flame. "I ask myself if I was drawn to you because you reminded me of Catherine, if I was trying to atone for my treatment of Richard by championing someone society has misjudged." "And your conclusion?" Grace asked, scarcely breathing. James stopped before her, his gaze intense. "That what I feel for you has nothing to do with the past and everything to do with who you are. Your intelligence, your quiet strength, your capacity for joy despite disappointment. These are what draw me to you, Grace. Not guilt, not rebellion, and certainly not pity." The words she had longed to hear, yet Grace remained wary. "And your mother, your position?" "My mother will adapt, or she will not. Either way, my mind is made." He took her hands once more, his grip firm and sure. "As for my position, it affords me the luxury of choosing my own happiness rather than bowing to convention. "James," Grace began, uncertainty clouding her joy, "you must know how society will react. The gossip, the speculation." "Let them talk," he interrupted. "Let them write their poisonous columns and whisper behind their fans. What do they know of true worth? They see only surfaces, never souls." His vehemence startled her. This was no fleeting impulse, but a decision reached after careful consideration. Yet Grace still hesitated, years of insecurity not so easily overcome. "I need you to be certain," she said quietly. "Not just now, in this moment of defiance, but for all the days to come. Because once this path is taken, there can be no return to the safety of conformity for either of us." James's expression softened. He released her hands, only to cup her face gently between his palms. "Grace Darlington, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." And then he was kissing her, a kiss so tender, yet so profound that Grace felt it in the very center of her being. All doubt, all fear dissolved in the heat of that connection, replaced by a certainty that matched his own. When they broke apart, breathless and flushed, the parlor door opened to reveal Aunt Agatha, her expression oscillating between shock and triumph. "Your Grace, this is most unexpected." James turned to face her, his arm remaining firmly around Grace's waist. "Mrs. Templeton, I must apologize for my abrupt arrival and the scene you have just witnessed. However, I cannot apologize for my feelings toward your niece." Aunt Agatha's eyes widened as she realized what was occurring. "Are you saying—" "I am saying," James continued with formal precision, "that I intend to ask for Miss Darlington's hand in marriage, with your blessing as her guardian." The room fell silent save for Aunt Agatha's audible gasp. Grace hardly dared breathe, the moment suspended between dream and reality. "This is most irregular," Aunt Agatha finally managed. "There has been no formal courtship, no announcement of intentions." "I am aware of the impropriety," James acknowledged. "But I find I cannot abide by convention when my happiness, and I hope Grace's, hangs in the balance." He turned to Grace, taking both her hands in his once more. "I have not asked you properly. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife, Grace? Will you bring your light, your wisdom, and your extraordinary beauty into my life forever?" Grace felt tears welling in her eyes, joy expanding within her chest until she thought it might burst. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, James." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. News of the engagement spread through London like wildfire, provoking reactions ranging from disbelief to outrage to grudging admiration. The Dowager Duchess made her displeasure known through pointed absence, while Aunt Agatha reveled in her newfound social prominence as aunt to the future Duchess of Clarenmont. Through it all, Grace found herself strangely calm. The opinions that had once held such power over her now seemed trivial compared to the certainty she felt in James's love and her own worth. They were attending a small dinner party at Lord and Lady Merryweather's home when Grace overheard a conversation that finally laid her doubts to rest. "I still cannot fathom what he sees in her," Lady Pemberton's daughter remarked to her companion, unaware that Grace stood just beyond the partially open drawing-room door. "She is so unusual looking." "Have you not heard?" the companion replied. "The Duke himself explained it most eloquently at White's last week when challenged by Lord Westfield about his choice." "Explained what?" "He said, some men require society's approval to recognize beauty. I prefer to trust my own judgment. And my judgment tells me that Grace Darlington possesses a rare and perfect beauty that only reveals itself fully to those wise enough to look beyond convention." "How peculiar," Lady Pemberton's daughter sniffed. "Perhaps. But you should have seen the effect his words had. Half the men present suddenly claimed they had always found Miss Darlington striking, and the other half requested introductions at the earliest opportunity. It seems beauty, like fashion, is whatever a duke declares it to be." Grace slipped away before they could discover her presence, her heart full. Not because society now claimed to see what they had previously denied, their approval meant little to her now, but because James had defended her so publicly and with such conviction. The wedding took place at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a perfect June morning. Despite the Dowager Duchess's absence, the church overflowed with guests eager to witness the season's most unexpected match. Grace wore a gown of ivory silk adorned with seed pearls, her golden hair crowned with orange blossoms and a duchess's tiara that had belonged to James's grandmother. As she walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm, Grace saw only James waiting for her at the altar, his face alight with love and pride. In that moment, she finally understood the truth he had been teaching her since their first meeting. Beauty existed not in conformity to an arbitrary standard, but in the perfect alignment of one soul recognizing itself in another. "Dearly beloved," the bishop began, his voice echoing through the hushed church, "we are gathered here today." The words washed over Grace like a benediction. She had entered the season believing herself unworthy of love, convinced that her appearance had determined her destiny. How wrong she had been. It was not her face that had changed, but her perception of herself, a transformation made possible by one man's ability to see beyond society's narrow definitions. When James slipped the ring onto her finger and spoke his vows, his voice rang with certainty. "With this ring I thee wed, with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, Grace caught sight of her reflection in one of the church's ornate mirrors. For the first time, she saw what James had always seen, not the golden gargle of cruel whispers, but a woman of unique and compelling beauty, her face illuminated from within by confidence and joy. Later, at the wedding breakfast held at Clarenmont House, Grace found herself momentarily alone with Helena in a quiet corner of the grand ballroom. "Well, Duchess," Helena teased gently, "how does it feel to have transformed from social afterthought to the most envied woman in England in the space of a single season?" Grace smiled, watching James across the room as he conversed with guests. "Like the most wonderful dream, except I never want to wake." "You won't," Helena assured her, following her gaze. "The way he looks at you, as if you're the only woman in existence, that is not the look of a man whose affections will waver." "No," Grace agreed softly. "It is not." "And the Dowager," Helena asked, "will she reconcile to the match, do you think?" As if summoned by the question, the Dowager Duchess herself appeared at the entrance to the ballroom, her arrival causing a ripple of whispers. She stood rigid and regal, surveying the gathering with imperial disdain. "It appears we may soon find out," Grace murmured, straightening her shoulders as James approached his mother. Their exchange was brief, too distant to overhear, but the Dowager's grudging nod before allowing James to escort her toward Grace spoke volumes. "Your Grace," Grace greeted her mother-in-law with a respectful curtsy. The Dowager's gaze was still cool, but lacked its former contempt. "Duchess," she acknowledged, the title a concession in itself. "It seems congratulations are in order. My son appears, content with his choice." "I assure you, mother," James said, his hand finding Grace's, "I am far more than merely content. I am blessed beyond measure." A flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps resignation, crossed the Dowager's face. "Well," she said after a moment, "the deed is done. We shall see what comes of it." It was hardly a warm welcome, but Grace recognized it for what it was, the first tentative step toward acceptance. As the celebration continued around them, James led Grace onto the terrace for a moment of privacy. The summer afternoon was perfect, the gardens of Clarenmont House in full bloom below them. "Happy, my love?" James asked, his arms encircling her waist. Grace leaned back against his chest, savoring the solid strength of him. "Perfectly." "Even though society still whispers," he teased gently, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Let them whisper," Grace replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Their opinions matter nothing to me now. I know my own worth, and I know your heart. What else could possibly be important?" James smiled, the love in his eyes making her breath catch. "Nothing," he agreed. "Absolutely nothing at all." And as he lowered his mouth to hers, Grace Darlington Clarenmont, once pitied, now envied, once dismissed, now celebrated, knew with absolute certainty that true beauty, like true love, existed not in the judgment of others, but in the perfect recognition of one soul by another. Society might laugh, society might whisper, but in the end, society would learn what one extraordinary duke had known from the beginning, that beauty took many forms, and the rarest and most precious was that which revealed itself only to those wise enough to truly see.